There is a number that Californians encounter every time they pull into a gas station. And for years, that number has functioned as a kind of daily reminder that living in the most populous state in America comes with a specific and recurring financial penalty. California gasoline prices have sat above the national average for so long that most residents have simply absorbed the premium as a fact of life, the way they absorb the housing costs and the income taxes and the utility bills that together make California one of the most expensive places to exist in the United States. But in recent months, that premium has stopped feeling like a background condition and started feeling like a crisis. Prices have spiked at moments that seemed disconnected from global oil markets. Refinery after refinery has announced reduced output, temporary shutdowns, or permanent closures. And the supply cushion that once gave California some protection against sudden price shocks has been worn down to a point where a single unexpected outage can send prices at the pump lurching upward by 20 or 30 cents in a matter of days. This is the story of how California's refinery system arrived at its current condition, what the shutdown of major refining capacity has done to the state's fuel supply and the people who depend on it, and why the structural forces now pushing refineries out of California are not going to reverse themselves, regardless of what happens to oil prices globally. Before we go further, I want to point something out. More than 90% of viewers watching these economic documentaries haven't subscribed yet. If you're interested in understanding what's really happening behind America's energy costs, corporate decisions, and economic shifts, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the deeper story behind the headlines. And while you're here, I'd like to know your opinion. Do you think California's fuel prices will keep rising as more refineries shut down? Comment below. To understand why refinery closures hit California harder than they would hit almost any other state, you have to understand the degree to which California operates as an island when it comes to gasoline supply. That isolation is not geographic in the traditional sense. California shares borders with other American states and sits adjacent to major energy infrastructure. But because California requires its own unique blend of gasoline, formulated specifically to meet the state's strict air quality standards, it cannot simply import fuel from refineries in Texas, Louisiana, or the Gulf Coast when its own supply runs short. The fuel those refineries produce does not meet California's specifications. It cannot be sold at California pumps without reformulation. And the infrastructure to move large volumes of compliant fuel quickly from outside the state into California's distribution network does not exist at a scale that would meaningfully buffer a major supply disruption. This means that when a California refinery goes down, whether for scheduled maintenance, an unexpected equipment failure, or a permanent shutdown, the only places that can replace that lost supply in the short term are the other refineries still operating within California's borders. And as that group of operating refineries has grown smaller, the system's ability to absorb shocks without passing pain directly to consumers at the pump has diminished in step. California once operated one of the most extensive refinery networks in the United States. At the industry's peak, the state had dozens of refining facilities processing crude oil from California's own oil fields and from imports arriving at its deepwater ports. Over decades, that network was consolidated, upgraded, and in many cases eliminated, as older and less efficient facilities could no longer justify the capital investment required to meet tightening environmental standards, while remaining competitive against larger and newer operations elsewhere. By the early 2020s, California was down to roughly a dozen major refineries, concentrated primarily in the Los Angeles basin and the San Francisco Bay Area, with the bulk of the state's refining capacity held by a small number of very large facilities. That concentration created efficiency in normal operating conditions. It created fragility when conditions were not normal. The closure that landed with the most immediate and measurable impact on California's fuel supply was the decision by Phillips 66 to shut down its Los Angeles refinery, one of the largest and most significant refining operations on the West Coast. The facility, located in the Wilmington area near the Port of Los Angeles, had a processing capacity of approximately 139,000 barrels per day. Phillips 66 announced the shutdown in late 2023, with the closure completing in 2025. The company cited the economics of continued operation in California's regulatory environment as the primary driver of the decision. Upgrading the aging facility to meet current and anticipated future standards would have required capital investment at a scale that the company concluded could not generate acceptable returns given California's cost structure, its energy transition policies, and the long-term trajectory of California fuel demand. The Los Angeles refinery had been a fixture of the region's industrial landscape for decades. Its closure removed a significant portion of Southern California's refining capacity in a single decision and sent an unmistakable signal to the rest of the industry about the direction of the California refining business. The Phillips 66 closure did not arrive without warning, and it did not arrive alone. Valero had already been making decisions that reduced its California refining footprint. PBF Energy's Martinez refinery, located in the Bay Area, had gone through a significant ownership and operational transition that reduced its output during a period when Northern California fuel markets were already tight. The pattern across these decisions was consistent enough that industry analysts had been noting it for years before the consequences became visible to ordinary consumers at gas stations. The economics of refining in California had been deteriorating relative to alternatives for a long time, and the companies making capital allocation decisions were responding to that deterioration in the rational way that businesses respond to sustained economic pressure. They were directing investment elsewhere, reducing exposure to a regulatory environment they viewed as increasingly hostile to their operations, and in several cases, exiting the California market entirely. The regulatory environment that California refiners operate within is not a minor variable in their cost calculations. It is one of the defining features of what makes California refining fundamentally different from refining anywhere else in the United States. The California Air Resources Board administers one of the most stringent air quality regulatory regimes in the world, and refineries are among its primary targets. Refineries in California must comply with regulations from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, from the State Air Resources Board, and from local air quality management districts, of which there are several covering the major refining regions. The layering of these regulatory obligations creates compliance costs that have no equivalent in Texas, Louisiana, or other major refining states. When those costs are applied to facilities that are already aging and already requiring capital reinvestment simply to maintain current operations, the financial case for continued operation weakens steadily, and in many cases reaches a breaking point. California's cap-and-trade program, which requires refineries to purchase allowances for the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their operations, adds another cost layer that compounds over time as allowance prices have risen. In the program's early years, the compliance costs were manageable and largely absorbed within refinery operating margins. As the program matured and allowance prices climbed, the costs became more significant, reaching a point where they represented a meaningful fraction of total operating expenses for the largest facilities. Combined with California's low-carbon fuel standard, which establishes a separate compliance obligation tied to the carbon intensity of transportation fuels, California refiners face a dual regulatory burden that their competitors in other states simply do not carry. The companies that operate these facilities are not unaware of the policy intent behind these regulations. They understand that California is deliberately engineering a transition away from petroleum-based transportation fuels over time. What they are responding to is the economics of operating a capital-intensive industrial facility in an environment where the state's long-term policy direction is explicitly oriented toward reducing demand for the products that facility produces. The supply shock mechanism that turns a refinery closure into a consumer price crisis works through a chain of events that can move very quickly once it is set in motion. California's gasoline distribution system, like the refinery network that feeds it, has been optimized for efficiency under normal operating conditions and carries relatively limited redundant capacity to buffer disruptions. When a major refinery unexpectedly reduces output or goes offline entirely, whether for planned maintenance, an equipment failure, or a fire or other incident, the wholesale gasoline market in California responds almost immediately. Spot prices for California blend gasoline, which trade on a separate market from the national benchmark precisely because of the state's unique fuel specifications, can spike sharply within hours of a supply disruption becoming known to the market. Those wholesale price increases flow through to retail pump prices, with a lag of anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, depending on how individual station operators and fuel distributors manage their inventory and pricing. The result, from a consumer's perspective, is that prices at the pump can rise quickly, and for reasons that are not always immediately transparent. The spring refinery maintenance season has historically been one of the most reliable triggers for California price spikes, and it has become more pronounced as the refinery count has declined. Refineries typically schedule their most intensive maintenance work during the transition between winter and summer fuel blends, a period in late winter and early spring when multiple facilities may be simultaneously running at reduced capacity. In a system with more refining capacity than needed to meet demand, this scheduled reduction in output can be absorbed without meaningful price impact. In a system where the margin between normal supply and normal demand has been compressed by closures and capacity reductions, that same seasonal maintenance pattern becomes a recurring trigger for supply tightness and price spikes. California consumers have experienced this pattern with enough regularity that spring price increases have become almost expected. But the baseline from which those spikes launch has itself been rising as permanent capacity has been removed from the system. The geographic concentration of what remains of California's refining capacity creates a specific vulnerability that regulators and industry analysts have identified, but that no policy intervention has yet meaningfully addressed. With the bulk of remaining refining capacity located in two regional clusters, the Los Angeles Basin and the Bay Area, a significant disruption affecting either cluster has an outsized effect on the fuel supply for the entire state. Southern California and Northern California have limited ability to supplement each other's supply quickly in the event of a regional disruption, because the pipeline infrastructure connecting the two regions has limited spare capacity, and because the logistics of moving large fuel volumes by truck over the distances involved are both expensive and slow relative to the speed at which a supply disruption can affect pump prices. The system is, in the language of infrastructure risk management, insufficiently redundant for the consequences of failure. The Torrance Refinery, operated by PBF Energy in Los Angeles County, has been one of the most consequential single facilities in California's recent fuel price history, and not only because of its size. The Torrance Refinery experienced a significant explosion in 2015 under prior ownership, an incident that reduced its output for an extended period and contributed to a substantial Southern California price spike in the months that followed. The memory of that event has shaped how market participants and regulators think about the systemic risk posed by the concentration of California's remaining refining capacity. A single major unplanned outage at one of the state's largest remaining facilities is no longer a manageable disruption that the system absorbs quietly. It is a potential price crisis that affects millions of consumers almost immediately. That vulnerability does not diminish as the refinery network shrinks. It intensifies. The political response to California's fuel price spikes has followed a predictable pattern that has generated considerable public debate without producing structural changes to the supply conditions driving the price behavior. Governor Newsom and the California legislature have repeatedly pointed to refinery profit margins during price spike periods as evidence of price gouging, and have pursued legislative and regulatory remedies aimed at limiting refiner profits during supply disruptions. The Oil and Gas Price Gouging and Transparency Act, passed in 2024, established new reporting requirements and created a mechanism for the state to set a maximum refining margin during declared fuel emergencies. Refiners and fuel industry groups challenged these measures, arguing that the profit controls would reduce the financial incentive for refineries to maintain and invest in California operations, potentially accelerating the very capacity reductions the state was trying to prevent. The fundamental tension in that debate has not been resolved, because the underlying economics of California refining have not been resolved. The long-term demand picture for California gasoline adds a dimension to the refinery investment calculus that is difficult to argue around. California has set a 2035 deadline for ending the sale of new gasoline-powered passenger vehicles, a target that is part of the state's broader strategy for reducing transportation sector emissions. The trajectory toward that deadline, even accounting for the likelihood of delays and modifications, creates a planning environment for refiners in which the long-term demand for their core product in their largest market is explicitly projected to decline by policy mandate. Investing hundreds of millions of dollars in upgrading a California refinery to extend its operating life into the 2040s and beyond requires making a bet that the market for California-compliant gasoline will remain sufficiently robust to justify that investment against the alternative of deploying that capital in states where there is no comparable policy commitment to eliminating the product. Most major energy companies have concluded, reasonably given the information available to them, that the California bet does not pencil out. The workers employed at California refineries occupy a position in this story that deserves more attention than it typically receives in debates that tend to focus on prices, profits, and policy. Refinery work is among the highest-paying blue-collar employment available in the American economy. Experienced refinery operators, maintenance technicians, and process engineers in California have historically earned wages and benefits that place them solidly in the middle class and often well above it, with compensation packages that included strong pension benefits and health coverage that are increasingly rare in the broader labor market. The permanent closure of a refinery does not simply eliminate jobs that can be replaced by comparable employment elsewhere. It eliminates a specific category of high-wage industrial work in communities where those jobs have anchored local economies for generations. The surrounding communities, the suppliers, the service businesses, the schools, and local governments that depend on the tax base those facilities generate all absorb consequences that extend well beyond the employment count directly affected by a closure. Before you leave, I want to thank you for watching this report all the way through. But I also want to remind you that over 90% of viewers still haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these in-depth stories about economic change, energy policy, and the industries reshaping America, please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel continue growing. And before you go, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think California can solve its fuel crisis before more refineries shut down for good? Let me know in the comments below.